I was 26 when my CTO framed me over a COBOL patch I didn't design, didn't deploy alone, and definitely didn't break. One night, I was the guy fixing the system everyone else was scared to touch. The next morning, I was escorted out of the building like a threat. And the worst part? He made it look effortless, like he'd rehearsed it. I'm telling this now because if I don't say it out loud, it still feels like some surreal fever dream. And also because the man who buried me under that lie ended up falling into the hole he dug. But back then, I didn't know any of that. Back then, I still believed competence could protect you. I was hired as the modernization guy, the young back-end engineer who supposedly spoke both worlds, Python Go for the new microservices and enough COBOL to wrap legacy batch jobs with APIs. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I liked the challenge. Most of the core financial logic still lived in a mainframe older than my parents. People treated it like a sleeping dragon. Don't poke it, don't touch it, just pray it wakes up on schedule. My CTO, Marcus, loved to call me our bridge to the future. He said it in that polished way executives do. Warm smile, hand on your shoulder, rehearsed sincerity. But behind that charm was a man who feared details. He didn't understand legacy code, didn't want to learn it, and despised being reminded of that gap. What he excelled at was politics. Everyone knew it. Some admired it. I tried to ignore it. The trouble started when a regulatory update required changes to the overnight batch that calculated interest adjustments. The deadline was brutal. Fines started if we missed even one reporting cycle. The senior COBOL dev had just gone on medical leave, so Marcus pulled me into his office. He didn't sit. He didn't soften his tone. We need a patch tonight. Not tomorrow, not next sprint. Tonight, and keep it tight. No tickets, no committee. I'll cover the traceability. Just get it done. I hesitated, not because I couldn't do it. I'd already mapped the module. But bypassing the change board was a huge deal. Every modification to that job had to be logged, validated, and archived. We had whole binders documenting previous patches. I told him exactly that. He waved it off like I'd complained about the room being cold. Alex, these people love bureaucracy more than results. We need results. I'll put my name on it. You'll be fine. The thing is, he did follow up. He sent an email that said, verbatim, proceed with the accelerated fix. I approve the direct change. That line would later save me, but in that moment it just felt like reassurance. I replied with a full diff, test results, and the exact logic I planned to alter. Marcus didn't respond. He rarely did. Silence from him usually meant move. So that night, I stayed online with our operations guy while we deployed the patch to the mainframe. It passed all the checks. Logs were clean. Batch started on time. I went to sleep exhausted but relieved. I'd done everything by the book, except for the shortcuts Marcus demanded. At 2:17 a.m., I got a security notification on my phone. Mainframe remote access. Privileged account. Session opened. Not mine. I scrolled to see the username. Marcus. I stared at the screen for a few seconds. Half asleep, half confused. Maybe he was just verifying the job. Maybe he was nervous about the release. It wasn't unheard of. He had senior access, even if he didn't know how to use half of it. The thought bothered me, but not enough to keep me awake. I just flagged the alert to check in the morning and went back to sleep. In hindsight, that was the moment the ground quietly shifted beneath me. When I walked into the office the next day, the air had that charged stillness you feel right before a storm breaks. People weren't talking. They were whispering. Ops looked pale. Risk looked angry. And Marcus? Marcus was in the glass conference room, arms crossed, eyes narrowed like he'd just discovered a traitor. He saw me, motioned without opening the door, and mouthed, "Wait." I didn't know it yet, but that single word was the start of the fall. Not because something had gone wrong, but because someone needed to pay for it. The last normal moment of my career at that company was standing outside that conference room, holding my coffee, watching my CTO talk about my patch, like it was a loaded gun he'd begged me not to fire. I didn't hear the specifics. Not yet. But I saw enough. The stiff posture, the pointed gestures, the slide deck already on screen. My stomach tightened. By the time they called me in, the story was already written. I just hadn't been handed my role in it yet. By the time I sat down, the room already felt hostile. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just cold, sterile. Like everyone had rehearsed their lines except me. Marcus didn't look at me when I entered. He kept his eyes on the speakerphone, where compliance and risk were already dialed in. The director of risk spoke first, clipped, and direct. Alex, did you authorize a production COBOL batch change last night without submitting it through the change board? The question hit me harder than the tone, because it wasn't curiosity, it was accusation. I implemented the patch Marcus requested, I said carefully. He approved the accelerated change by email. Marcus finally turned, slow and deliberate, like he was disappointed in me. I approved an investigation, he said, not a deployment. You acted outside procedure. It was so absurd I almost laughed, but everyone in the room looked relieved, like the villain had been found early and now they wouldn't have to look any further. Risk continued. The overnight batch miscalculated interest for 30,841 accounts. Some were overcharged, some undercharged. That puts us in violation of reporting guidelines. My throat tightened, not because of guilt, because of the familiarity of the failure. I had seen something like this before. Incorrect rounding logic in legacy COBOL code. But I hadn't touched that part. It wasn't in my diff. I need to see the exact failure path, I said. The logic I modified wasn't in the... Marcus cut me off. The problem is that you modified anything at all. That's the issue. And that's when I realized something vital. They weren't here to understand. They were here to close the story. I opened my laptop. I documented the patch. All diffs, tests, and the email approval are... Marcus slammed his palm lightly on the table. Subtle, but enough. We're not discussing your documentation right now, he said. We're discussing your breach of protocol. You were explicitly told not to touch production code without a full change request. That's not true, I said and glanced around the table, searching for anyone whose face said they remembered the real sequence of events. No one met my eyes. He had prepped them. Of course he had. Let's move on, Risk said. We've already escalated to HR. They'll take it from here. Just like that. No analysis, no traceability review, no log reconciliation, no technical examination of what code changed and when. It wasn't even a bad investigation. It just wasn't an investigation at all. HR's meeting was waiting for me the moment I stepped out of the conference room. The HR manager, someone who had always been kind, nervous, apologetic, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before. It was fear, not of me, of her job. Alex, please come with me. That sentence always sounds the same in every firing story. Soft, practiced, inescapable. We went into a small room usually reserved for private calls. Inside, a folder sat neatly on the table before she even closed the door. I'm so sorry, she murmured, her gaze dropping. But due to a serious procedural violation and substantial operational impact, your employment is terminated effective today. I blinked. You didn't ask for my version. Her voice cracked. I wasn't allowed to. That told me everything. She slid the papers toward me. A termination letter citing gross negligence, a summary of the alleged unauthorized changes, and a pre-written statement saying I accepted the findings. I pushed that last page back. I'll sign receipt, I said, not agreement. Her eyes flickered with something like gratitude, the small relief of someone who still had a conscience. She adjusted the page order so I could leave with the only piece I was required to acknowledge. As I signed, something caught my eye in the paperwork. a printed excerpt of an email from Marcus, time-stamped at 6:42 p.m. the previous evening. Do not deploy anything to production until the change board reviews this. Alex has been notified. I never received that email, but HR had it, and it had been placed right on top. The first thing anyone reading the packet would see. A manufactured safety net. A perfect alibi. He had written his escape hatch before the failure even happened. My pulse went cold. This wasn't a panic reaction from him. This was premeditated. The IT support guy who escorted me to my desk tried not to make eye contact. I wasn't angry at him. He was following a script like everyone else. I packed quietly, my mug, my headphones, a small notebook. Nothing personal was left on my work machine. I kept everything clean by habit, but my laptop bag wasn't empty. I still had the printed diff of my patch. I still had the PDF of the approval email. I still had screenshots of our Slack conversation where Marcus told me, explicitly, to push tonight. I had more truth than I realized. As I walked out, past the glass rooms and polished hallways where I'd spent 2 years of my life fixing things that weren't my fault, I felt a strange calm settle into my chest. Not acceptance, not defeat, just clarity. Because Marcus believed he'd closed the loop. He believed he'd erased the timeline and rewritten the failure into my name. But he didn't know what I knew, and he didn't know what I had. I thought losing that job was the worst thing that could happen to me. I didn't know yet that the thing Marcus feared most was the truth finally being compared to the logs. For 3 months after the firing, my life looked calm from the outside. I freelanced, fixed legacy systems for small firms, took contracts nobody else wanted. I kept my head down. People assumed I'd moved on. I hadn't, because every recruiter call lasted exactly 15 minutes, right until the background check phase. Then the tone shifted, the follow-up stalled, and the emails turned polite and distant. Someone at my old company wasn't just blaming me internally. They were feeding that narrative outward. But that was just the beginning. Around week 12, I got an email from someone I didn't recognize, Eli Gardner, senior technical consultant, Harrow and Finch Advisory. A real firm, a real address, a real signature. He didn't ask for a meeting, he asked for verification. We are conducting an independent audit of the incident involving the interest calculation batch. Your name appears in the changelog. We'd like to confirm the sequence of modifications. That sentence alone told me everything. The board wasn't satisfied with Marcus's version. They'd hired forensic auditors. I replied with one line. Yes, I can walk you through my involvement. 2 hours later, we were in a video call. Eli was nothing like corporate investigators I'd imagined. He wasn't stiff. He wasn't hostile. He was methodical, the kind of mind that treated truth like an equation. He started with no small talk. Alex, I'm going to be straightforward. The logs don't add up. Which logs? I asked. All of them. He shared his screen. Audit trails, timestamp comparisons, access logs, file-level version histories. All layered, cross-referenced, color-coded. I knew the system well enough to follow immediately, and what I saw chilled me. There were comments labeled under my username at 2:40 a.m. I was asleep at that time. I even had the security alert showing Marcus accessing the mainframe then. There were parameter changes to rounding logic I never touched. There was a manual override to a fallback routine, masked in the logs as a supporting patch, pushed using a privileged account. Eli said quietly, "Your credentials couldn't have done this. You didn't have clearance for these functions." I nodded. "I know." He leaned forward. "Then I need every piece of documentation you kept. Emails, diffs, screenshots, all of it. The board asked us to reconstruct the timeline. And frankly, the current internal report doesn't survive scrutiny." I didn't rush. I didn't dramatize. I opened my archive folder, the one I'd built in those gray weeks after being escorted out. Every artifact was labeled. Date, time, source, verification. I sent him the entire bundle. Approval email from Marcus. patch diff, pre-deployment test logs, Slack screenshots, the security alert showing his 2:17 a.m. login. Eli studied the files for a long moment without speaking. Then he exhaled. "Alex, this isn't negligence. This is orchestration." A quiet line, no emotion, but it hit with the weight of a verdict. "Why?" I asked. Eli paused, not because he didn't know, but because he was choosing words the way auditors choose evidence. "There's pressure on the company. Marcus promised the board he'd modernize operations by Q3. He didn't, and the cost overruns on his cloud migration plan put him in a corner. A regulatory failure tied to legacy code, that gives him a scapegoat. And then he stays clean," I finished. "Young engineer screws up ancient system. Narrative writes itself." Eli nodded once. "The problem is your documentation contradicts his story, and the logs contradict his actions." The way he said his actions made something inside me finally tighten, not as fear, but as recognition. I understood now. Marcus wasn't careless. He was cornered, and cornered people rewrite history. Eli continued. "The audit committee wants to interview you. They'll ask direct questions. They'll want direct answers. Nothing more, nothing less." "I'll answer anything," I said. "I know," he replied. "That's why we're calling you." The audit committee meeting wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, the way real consequences usually begin. I joined by video. Faces I remembered, directors, legal counsel, risk officers, filled the tiles on my screen. Marcus was in the physical room. He didn't look at the camera. Eli began. He walked the committee through the logs, calm, surgical, page by page, my patch, my test documentation, the approval email, the late-night privileged login by Marcus, the commit discrepancies, the unauthorized parameter changes. Finally, he asked me a single question. "Alex, did you at any point deploy code to production that was not explicitly authorized by the CTO?" "No," I said, "and I can verify every step I took." Silence. Not awkward. Heavy. Marcus shifted in his chair. The audit chairwoman turned to him. "Marcus, would you like to respond?" He cleared his throat. "I may have checked the system overnight, but the primary issue here is that Alex pushed a—" Eli interrupted gently. "Please scroll to Exhibit 14. A screenshot filled the room, Marcus's own email. Proceed with the accelerated fix. I approve the direct change." Timestamp and headers intact. Another silence. Longer this time. Marcus tried to pivot, but his voice caught, his sentences breaking, then backtracking, then contradicting his previous explanation. Watching him stumble wasn't satisfying. It was clarifying. Because in that moment, it became obvious to everyone. Only one version of the story consistently matched the evidence. Not mine. The truth. The session ended quietly. No verdict. No confrontation. Just a polite, "Thank you, Alex. We'll be in touch." But something had shifted. I shut my laptop and sat in the dim afternoon light of my apartment. The world strangely still. For the first time since everything fell apart, I felt a small crack in the weight pressing against me. They thought I wanted my old job back. I didn't. What I wanted was for the truth to stop whispering and finally speak loud enough that no one could ignore it. The email from the audit committee arrived 9 days later. No build-up, no dramatic warning, just a short formal message. "Alex, the committee has concluded its review. We would appreciate a meeting at your earliest convenience." Corporate language always hides the temperature of the room, but this line was different. It felt careful, intentional, like they'd already crossed a point they couldn't walk back from. We met on a Thursday afternoon. Their cameras were on this time. The general counsel, the audit chairwoman, a board member I'd never spoken to, and Eli, the only face I trusted in that grid. The chairwoman began, her voice steady. "Alex, thank you for your cooperation. The findings were significant. Significant. Corporate code for someone at the top is in real trouble. She continued, "We've determined that the initial internal report was materially inaccurate. There were unauthorized privileged accesses to production systems, inconsistencies in the change documentation, and evidence of deliberate misrepresentation." That phrase, deliberate misrepresentation, was the quiet thunder that ends careers. And then she said Marcus's name. Not angrily, not dramatically, just plainly, like reading the final line of an equation. Marcus's actions violated policy and compromised the integrity of the technical organization. He is no longer with the company. I didn't breathe for a moment, not out of shock, out of recognition. This wasn't vengeance. This was gravity finally doing its job. They didn't give details. They couldn't. But the subtext was clear. The board had removed him, likely for cause, and the legal team was preparing whatever disclosures were required. In our industry, that wasn't a slap on the wrist. That was professional exile. The chairwoman shifted slightly, softening her tone. "Alex, your termination was based on information that we now know was false. We would like to correct that." This was the part I had prepared for, not emotionally, but practically. I didn't want an apology. I wanted a record that couldn't be rewritten again. The General Counsel outlined the board's proposal. 1. Full reversal of the gross negligence classification. My file would be amended to reflect a neutral separation, position eliminated, the corporate equivalent of erasing a scar. 2. A formal letter affirming that I had been responsible for the incident, signed by the board's audit committee, unofficial letterhead, immutable. 3. A severance equivalent compensation package. Not hush money. Documentation explicitly stated it was a correction for a wrongful process. 4. An invitation to consult on their modernization roadmap. Not an employment offer, a contract. Detached, professional, optional. I listened in silence. When they finished, I asked the only question that mattered. Will my amended file reflect that the original conclusion was incorrect, not just that I'm being reclassified? The General Counsel nodded. Yes, that distinction is important. This, right here, was the real victory. Not money, not prestige, not vengeance. Truth, documented, permanent. I accepted the correction, the documentation, and the compensation. I declined the consulting role, politely, not because I was bitter, but because returning, in any capacity, would anchor me to a past I had finally outrun. The meeting ended the way corporate meetings always end. A few stiff nods, a few polite phrases, the illusion that everything was resolved cleanly. But as the call ended, Eli stayed behind for a moment. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't offer advice. He just said, "You kept everything. Most people don't. That's why this worked. Not luck, not karma. Preparation. The weeks after that were quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. Not the hollow quiet of unemployment or the oppressive quiet of uncertainty. A clean quiet. I moved into a new apartment, a smaller place with no memory of the night I read my termination papers at the kitchen counter. I opened a tiny consultancy specializing in exactly the kind of legacy systems everyone feared but every financial institution depended on. Clients came faster than I expected. Good ones. Ones that valued someone who didn't panic when faced with code written in 1984. I never bragged about what happened. I never told potential clients the story. In this industry, reputation moves in whispers. And now those whispers finally aligned with the truth. One evening, months later, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Former CTO under regulatory review for failure to disclose operational risk incident. It wasn't my doing. It wasn't personal. It was consequences. The kind that follow you long after lies stop working. I set the phone down, no triumph, no adrenaline, just a steady, grounded sense that the world had finally recalibrated. Not in my favor, just correctly. Sometimes people expect a revenge story to end with fireworks, confrontations, dramatic justice, a villain brought to their knees in a public spectacle. But real life isn't a movie. Real justice is quiet. It happens in boardrooms, audit logs, updated HR files, amended documents. It happens when truth outlives the narrative built to bury it. And mine did. Now, when I think about Marcus, there's no anger left. He wasn't a monster, just a man who thought no one would ever question him. A man who assumed the system would bend around his version of events. But systems don't bend forever. Eventually, someone checks the logs. My career didn't end at 26. It started there. And the man who tried to bury me, he ended up digging the hole so deep, he was the only one who couldn't climb out.